Series here talking about a life of gratitude. And we've been taking some different approaches looking at gratitude. The very first Sunday we started with the gift of gratitude to God. And then second week we talked about guarding our soul with gratitude. And then last Sunday we did something kind of different. We did what we called words and praise of gratitude. It was kind of a mix of music and speaking. We didn't do the live video, which many people commented about, which means obviously people are using the live video. So welcome to all of you. But I know many of our church family, whether they're sick or ill or can't be here, a lot of our people are joining us live online, so we very much appreciate that. And so this morning, we're going to be wrapping up our series, and we're going to be talking about this idea of gratitude and generosity. And we have saved this one for the end for a specific reason. For the last couple of years, I'm not even sure how many years we've been doing Sunday for the Poor. Some of you would probably know more than me. Won't even try to guess, but we've been doing the Sunday for the Poor for many, many years. And one of the things that we do is we used to do kind of just one Sunday for the poor. We would have various different people in like we've been doing through the month. And we would take the one Sunday a year and see how much we could kind of pack into one service. And we wanted to try something new. We wanted to try something different this month. So we decided to do a little bit of every week. The different organizations we support, the different community groups that we support. And so it's been good to hear a little bit of all of it instead of it kind of all packed into one. And so we've kind of turned this into a whole month-long series talking about gratitude. And so part of Sunday for the Poor was a Sunday where the offering would go to support the various causes, the ones abroad and even at home. And so that's going to be a part of today. I want to thank Carol and all the Who Dat team for the work that they've done this month, and also from our ladies from the Northern Haven who are actually able to be here in person, and just a great group of people. I also want to thank all of you, Slave Lake Alliance Church people, for your generosity and for your faithfulness and your giving and your support in all of this. And so I just want to thank you for all of that and all of your care and concern in what you've been doing here at the church. And so as I mentioned this morning, we're going to be talking about generosity. Now, I know you all love it when a pastor wants to talk about money. You're always like, oh yeah, here we go. I knew this was going to happen. This is all they care about is the money. No, that's not what we're talking about this morning. Generosity, I think, has a lot more to it than just about money. But at the same time, it takes financial contributions to make things happen. But what I'm concerned today more about is not just your money, but how do we live this idea of a life of gratitude? What does it mean to be generous? Because I think when we think about generosity, people, it has to be more than just about money. We have to talk about generosity in many different forms of our life, because what we know and what we see and what we're going to talk about is that when we practice generosity as a regular part of everyday living, you will find out it changes your life. It would lead to joy. It leads to happiness. It leads to contentment. And so really the definition of generosity, I just looked it up this week, is the virtue of giving good things to others freely and abundantly. Generosity is the virtue of giving good things to others freely and abundantly. And as I said, generosity, whether you know it or not, is actually a learned trait. I don't think by nature we are generous. I think generosity is something we grow in, something we learn. Actually, I think generosity is also an ultimate expression of love. And so when we think about generosity, there is this kind of weird paradox that happens when you talk about generosity. Because here's what usually happens to us. When I am generous to someone, right? Many of us are doing that today. It's our Sunday for the Poor. We're giving towards some great causes, both abroad and in our community. But what many of us do is we will give of our resources to help another. And what it can appear is that you're actually incurring a deficit. Right? I took money out of my bank in order to give to these causes, right? So we can look at generosity as a bit of a deficit. I've taken my hard-earned money and I'm giving it to someone else. So therefore, I have less money in my bank account. But here is why I think generosity is this strange paradox. Because when we are generous people, it is not a zero-sum balance. It is not a win-lose result. Right? The charity wins, but I lose in my bank account. I really believe the paradox of generosity is that it's a win-win situation. It is a win-win result. And so this morning, I want you to really consider that, the paradox of generosity. That you won't see it as Sunday for the poor is a win for a generation and a loss for me, but that I want you to see that it is a win for the causes that we donate to, but it's also a win for you as an individual and as a person. Because here is what we know about generosity. There is this interesting relationship between generosity and money and joy and happiness. I read an interesting book this week. I've had it for years. I always find all these strange books online and I keep them and I never know when I'm going to use it, but it was this title, The Paradox of Generosity. And so some of the thoughts are from this book I was reading this week. We all know the old saying, right? Money can't buy happiness. It still tends to hold true. But what we know is that giving money away actually does bring happiness. And if you're a Christian today, we are actually called to a radical generosity. We are called to be generous because our God is generous with us. He has given all He has to us. I read an interesting quote this week from a guy named Gordon MacDonald. He said this. He said, God the Father is the first generous giver. And then God the Son is the chief of generous givers. And God the Holy Spirit is the ongoing expression of God's generosity in us. You see, we are called to a life of gratitude, which means we are called to a life of generosity. And I don't think it matters whether you believe in God or not. I want to show you today that there is a close connection between gratitude and generosity, and that it is a life worth living, no matter what we believe. And so as I was reading this book, the authors were doing this study on generosity, and some of the things they found to be very interesting as I was reading this. The evidence shows very clearly that the practice of regular generosity, and what they mean is over and over again, weekly, monthly, whatever it might be, regular practice of generosity can lead to a greater sense of happiness in someone's life. There is massive amounts of data to prove that this is true. And this is what they're talking about. The paradox of generosity is a win-win situation. As I give, I also receive. As I give to these various causes, I am receiving something in return. As we give to Sunday for the poor, do you know what you receive in return? Joy, happiness, contentment. You see, we see this connection in Scripture as well. We know that God knows us better, I think, than we even know ourselves at times. And so in the book of 2 Corinthians, we see that the author Paul here is talking about generosity. And so in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, we're going to read it quick, but what's going on is Paul is actually raising money for famine relief. There's a great famine going on. He's trying to provide for the famine that's happening in Jerusalem, and he's come to the church and he's come to the people saying, we need help to help these people. And so 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 15 says this. And this is again Paul's words. He says, he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food will supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all your generosity, which through us will produce thanksgiving to God. There's our connection of generosity and thanksgiving, as we've been talking about. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but it is also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission, flowing from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others. while they long for you and pray for you, because of the surpassing grace of God upon you. Thanks be to God for this inexpressible gift. You see, as you read through here, there is very much a give and receive. What was interesting as I was reading and through it this week and thinking about this, what you're experiencing is really just a threefold impact of generosity. And it's going to sound very familiar, or it should be by now. Do you know what the threefold we're seeing? Physical, spiritual, and emotional needs that are being met by the church. Our mission as a church is because we love God and care about people. We are compelled to address the spiritual, physical, and emotional needs of our church, that's you, in our community, the community groups that we're supporting. You see, the generosity Paul is asking for is meeting one of those three needs, right? When we are generous to people, to the various mission groups on the other side of the world, when we are generous to the groups within our own community, we are impacting them with all three. When we give money to the various groups, we are providing for physical needs, food, shelter. You just saw it, what Northern Haven said. We've seen it, what goes on in Rwanda from World Vision, food for the hungry. We're providing for physical food and shelter through our giving. When we give money, when we're generous, we're also experiencing the spiritual, right? We saw that in the videos, right? You saw adults and children praising God for providing, which is you. There's that spiritual component. They see that as we give across the world, they are giving praise and thanks to God for the giving. And when we give money, they're sensing the emotional. When we are generous, it's joy, happiness, and emotional health. You see, people, this study of this paradox of generosity, what was interesting is that it revealed something. One of these guys was a Christian. I think one of them wasn't. I'm not sure. But they're mostly a couple authors who are working out of big U.S. schools. But they said, what they found interesting is that those who give at least 10% of their income are much happier than those who don't. The study clearly showed the practice of giving away 10% is associated with a greater possibility of being happy in life. But what also they made known was generosity wasn't just about money. See, they also talked about this idea of volunteer generosity. And what they found is those who volunteer, those who give of their time, those who give of their energy, are often much happier than those who don't. In their one study, it said those who volunteer 5.8 hours a month, I don't know how they came up with the number based on the people, are very happy compared to those who only give a few minutes a month. So I think there's a volunteer generosity that many of us are part of. On the other end, they talked about this idea of relational generosity. And what this means is to invest in people with our emotions and our attention. That's family and friends. Those are people we're close with. I would add in, that's our church. They didn't add that in. And what this article is saying, those who do this, those who show and do relational generosity are often much happier as well, because they are investing emotionally with one another. Another one they talked about is this idea of neighborly generosity. Similar to the relational generosity, but without the emotional connection, it said. This was what we just call the purely physical connection. Spending time with people, getting to know your neighbor, help shovel some snow, do whatever it is that's going on, helping a neighbor move, do something in your yard. It's more of this idea of kind of like a hospitality. And often those people are much happier than those who don't. So let me ask you this question. How important is generosity to you? How important is it for you to be generous financially? How important is it for you to be generous with volunteering? How important is it for you to be generous in your relationships How important it is to you to be generous with your neighbors. How important is joy, happiness, and contentment to you? Because the studies are showing us that those two go together. They cannot be separated. The more generous we are in life with time, energy, finances, whatever it is, the greater sense of joy, the greater sense of happiness. Here's what's interesting. This study came up. They found those that are more generous with time and energy and money, what they found was interesting is they're also in much better health. So forget the diet, just be generous, right? That's good because I don't have to work out anymore. Forget it, right? I'm just going to be generous. But what they're showing is that generosity in parts of our life, they said, was leading to better health. So if you want better health, maybe it's to volunteer. Maybe if you want better health, it is to take up the shovel and help a neighbor or do something in their yard. Here's what I learned in this book also. This was kind of one of their summation thoughts. Is that there is a very large relationship between generosity and the purpose of life. They said generosity and the purpose of life go hand in hand. Those who are generous have a greater purpose in life. They went on to say that generosity helps with depression. Generosity can help with anger. It's not a cure. They weren't saying it's a cure, but it can help because it helps with an attitude. It helps with mindset. It's less focus on this and more focus on that. Less focus on me, more focus on you. I find it interesting that we live in a day and age where everybody wants to be happy and feel joy and contentment. Everybody wants to know the purpose of life. And lo and behold, it might be found in generosity, which is so counterculture to the way our world thinks. And as Christians, our source of all that generosity needs to be found in God Himself. Which means the more generous we become, the more joy you will find. Maybe the healthier we will be. Maybe it leads to less depression or anger or frustration. What they also found is those that are more generous have a greater sense of personal growth. You want to grow, you want to mature, and you want to keep changing. Those that are not generous are just content to stay the way they are. And so I think gratefulness and generosity go hand in hand for the Christian. You see, our motivation comes from a very different place. We understand that God created everything and that He has provided for all that we need, which means then we are free to give it all away. And when I say give it all away, I'm not talking about living on the street, give it away. I'm talking about that we are free to give away time, energy, finances, whatever it is that God is calling us. And the reason that we can do this, and one of the things Paul kind of subtly points out there is that's in accordance with the gospel. The good news of Jesus Christ is about a give and receive. He gave His life so we may receive life. He died on the cross in our place for our sins so we don't have to. He gave so we receive. If you are a Christian today, you have been touched by God's grace. Which means in life, we owe everything to Him because of His life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So as a Christian, we have a lot to be grateful for. We have much to be thankful for. But in some strange reason, that's not always how people view us. I haven't really figured that one out yet. And so whatever community groups we are a part of, whatever money we give to Sunday for the poor, we need to continue to grow in gratefulness and generosity. Do the people you spend time with see you that way? Do they see you as a thankful, grateful person? Do they see you as a generous person? Because people, true generosity is a lifestyle. That's what we're talking about. It's not merely just a monthly contribution to a church. It's so much more than that. In the church, we want to have an attitude of gratitude giving, not guilt giving. I don't want you to give to this church or God's kingdom out of guilt. I want us to give to God's kingdom. I want to give to these causes out of gratitude of what God has done for us. Because here's the thing. I think gratitude, not guilt, produces greater generosity. Let me say that again. Gratitude, not guilt, produces greater generosity. Let me explain how that works. You will often find, you see it in the news all the time, that there are often people as they pass away or whatever it is, they will often leave large amounts of money, especially to like hospitals. Right? You've probably seen in the news, someone died, they left a large amount into hospitals. You see it in the United States. You see it here too, where people leave large amounts of money to universities, you know? And why do people do that? I think what happens is these people are grateful from what they have received from these places. As many of you know, this past week, my wife had surgery. Everything is going okay so far. We had a little bit of an outing yesterday. This has been an ongoing issue, as we've talked about before. She's had 5 surgeries, so this was number 6, and we're hoping this is the last one. And so we tried something a little bit different. We're just keep praying that God knows what's going on. But the surgery was done in Edmonton at the Royal Alec. So Heather and I, on Monday morning, we went down to the Royal Alec Hospital and got her all checked in, and we went into the day surgery. They put you in this little tiny room, and in walks this nurse. She's all masked up, but I'm like, I know you. And she's like, Heath and Heather. And it turned out it was a friend of ours, Christy. Christy and her husband, Mike, were youth pastors with me many, many years ago. He was the youth pastor at St. Albert Alliance when I was at Southgate Alliance. And so here we are in the center, and those are my moments where I see that God provides, and his kindness and generosity was somebody we knew to kind of bring down the anxiety and stress of going into surgery for number 6. We knew this one was a little bit more dangerous and invasive than the previous ones. And so Heather and I were there, and it was kind of reassuring to have an advocate if we needed one. And so Heather had the surgery, and again, went okay as far as we know. And then they put her in the building right beside, which is called the Lois Hole Center. And the Lois Hole Center is a center for women. Now, you may not know the name Lois Hole. Lois Hole and her husband owned a greenhouse in St. Albert, where I grew up. Lois Hole and her husband had, at one point, one of the largest greenhouses in Western Canada, right in St. Albert, not far from where I grew up. I remember seeing Lois Hole. My mother and I would get flowers. She'd say hi. She kind of knew everybody. Later on in life, Lois Hole had passed away of cancer, and so did her husband. Both of them were treated at the Royal Alec Center, and that's where both of them had passed on. And when Lois and her husband had died many years of cancer, they had given a donation to the Royal Alec, and then this wing was named after her. And so donation was made in gratefulness for what this center had done for them. Gratitude, not guilt, produces greater generosity. In fact, gratitude, I think, begets generosity. The more grateful we are, the more we want to give. I don't ever want to be a church where money around here is guilt. There's no point in that. It gets nowhere. That's the wrong heart. That's the wrong motive. Our God doesn't come to us and say, hey, let's talk about your guilt. I know my son died on the cross for your sin and shame, but I'm going to keep bringing up the guilt. When Jesus died on the cross, the shame and the guilt was taken from us. And so we don't want to do generosity as a church out of guilt. Generosity, I also believe, increases and expands our social network. Right? Greater relational ties to these various community groups that we're involved in, greater connection with World Vision or Food for the Hungry. Right? When we volunteer in our church and in our community, it should lead to a greater joy and happiness. Many of you volunteer in this church. Some of it is more public. Some of it is behind the scenes with adults, with teenagers, and with children. Generosity should be bringing us together. It's a shared experience. And so generosity is not what I'll call a static activity, but it's a very, very active activity. Here's what's interesting as we close up, as I was reading this book, some stats they had based on some of the studies. It said in there that only 2.7% of people give 10% of their income away. So what that means is 97% don't. They said 13.9% of people give less than 2% of their income away. And then here's the interesting number. 44.8% of people, as they did this big poll, do nothing. So that's half the population. 44.8% of people in this world are giving up their chance to be happier and healthier and to have joy and can have contentment. They're choosing not to. 24% of people volunteer time and talent. 76 don't volunteer at all. And so where do you find yourself? We are within a church. I think church people generally are more generous. According to the stats, maybe half of us are not generous. Maybe half of our world is trying to find happiness, joy, and contentment in themselves. Right? They're searching for joy and purpose in themselves. They keep going in. That's a very popular thing. Just look inside, look inside, look inside. And that's where the darkness is. That's where we're not supposed to turn. The book of Jeremiah calls the heart desperately wicked and sick and not to be followed or even listened to. But we are in a day and age where just search your own heart, search your own heart, search your own heart. The good news of the gospel is as we go to the cross, we go external, not internal. To find joy and happiness and contentment is not in our things. It's not even within our own life. Sometimes our temptation is to keep the money for ourselves and our time for ourselves for self-preservation. More and more people, I think, do this so we can control our life and try to control the outcomes of life. And what I want us to consider is what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians, that we are to be a generous people. And we are to be grateful and generous because it is actually for our own good. It is for our own well-being. It makes us healthier and happier. What is interesting is even this one article said it doesn't mean generous people don't have problems. It doesn't mean generous people don't have time problems. It doesn't mean generous people don't have money problems. What they said is what it means is that they face life with contentment and a sense of gratitude for what they do have, even if it's not much. They do not sit around and focus on what they don't have. And so can I be grateful and generous with what I have today? Can I remember the paradox of generosity, that it's actually a win-win situation? It's a give and receive. Our God has given His very Son for us. In His grace and mercy, He provided a way out for sin, for shame and guilt, and so therefore we are set free from all of that. And so as Christians, we must be the most grateful people, but also the most generous people. And so I want to continue to grow in that as a church as we wrap up our series. Let's continue to be grateful. Let's continue to be generous physically, spiritually, and emotionally to one another. Are we being generous that way to one another? Are we being generous that way to people within our community? And so I'm going to invite up Carol. Carol's going to come and close, I think, here. And then when Carol's done, I'll come back.